What's up, guys? Rick from DFS On Demand here with a preview for week 1 of the NFL season. It's finally here. Before we jump into that, I do want to go through a couple of housekeeping items. I assume a lot of you watching this video may have never seen any of my videos before. I make a lot of videos for the PGA Tour, strategy in general. So if you're new, welcome. I want to give you a few updates and ideas of what's going on here. So you're watching or you're listening to this on either YouTube, or this is available in podcast version on iTunes, Spotify, basically wherever you get your podcast. Search DFS On Demand. You should be able to find it. Otherwise, what I like to do is I don't like to tout players specifically. I don't like to tell you who to play like you might see on other channels. It's one of these things where the type of format that you're playing is obviously different than what I might be playing. Your risk tolerance might be different than my risk tolerance. I like to take very volatile players, which is a high risk play. You might not like that. It's dependent on how many lineups you're making. So there's just a million factors where you're never going to hear me make a definitive statement that's like, oh, you have to play Aaron Rodgers no matter what. It's just not going to happen. What I like to do is I go through the tools that I've created. So they're custom tools to me. They're all available on DFS On Demand. Basically, I go through and I point out what I think are the most interesting things. I'm trying to make your research process as painless as possible. I'm open for discussion. I'm open for debate. I like to start a conversation in either on Twitter or here in the comments. So that's basically the way this works. Just wanted to give you guys a heads up in case you're new. Let's get into week 1. All right, week 1 of the NFL season. It's finally here. It feels like it's been a decade. The way we're going to do this is I'm just going to kind of talk through position by position. I assume these videos are going to change drastically over the course of the year as the tools continue to evolve, the discussion continues to evolve. But let's start with quarterbacks here at week 1. If you're watching on YouTube, I'm showing you essentially my projections here. I've got projections by every position. We've got them broken down by salary, so you can kind of look at the chart and see who might be a good value. And we're going to start with quarterbacks. And my highest projected quarterback is going to be Drew Brees, coming in at $6,800 on DraftKings. And I'm not normally the type of guy who likes to pay up for quarterback. The stats kind of show that, especially for GPPs, if you're trying to win something like the Millionaire Maker or one of these very large tournaments, that you probably should not pay up for quarterback. There's just a lot of value everywhere else that you can find. But if you're looking to pay up, Drew Brees is probably the guy. He's probably pretty chalky. I think a lot of people are going to own him. But the reasons are clear, right? You know, he's the the fourth most expensive quarterback at $6,800 on DraftKings. He's playing Tampa Bay, who, as I click through here, this is obviously last season's defense versus position. No team gave up more points to opposing quarterbacks than Tampa Bay last year. So obviously they're going to have a few different pieces of personnel. We don't have a lot of data to work with in week 1, but just going back to last year. And then if we bring up Drew Brees for his player profile, what you're going to find is, you know, he had a really down year last year, especially by his standards, right? So there's reasons to be concerned that the Saints aren't throwing the ball nearly as much. Their run game was great. They were a very efficient team on the ground last year. They didn't have to throw the ball. With that being said, while Drew Brees did not have the ceiling that he had in previous seasons, he was one of the most consistent quarterbacks on the slate, in all of fantasy last year, right? He was basically within 2/100ths of a fantasy point, both home and away, which is for the first time we've ever seen Drew Brees do that. Just a very consistent play. So you might want to target him more in cash games because he probably has a pretty high floor against Tampa Bay. But with the way the usage might be shaking out with Alvin Kamara, his ceiling might be a little bit capped. So keep that in mind. All right, there are a couple other guys here that I think are interesting. Right here, Matt Stafford sitting at $6,500 I think is pretty interesting. I won't run you through this entire thing here, but what I do is I have production shares. So I've got, the percentage of targets for last year, rush attempts by team, all that good stuff. But then I also have it for projections. So if you go to the second tab here, these are team projections for week 1. And what we have is essentially there's only like 5 or 6 guys who are accounting for like 27% or more of their team's fantasy production in week 1. Obviously all projected, right? We're projecting this. But I won't take you through them. But the guys are Deshaun Watson, Alex Smith, Jimmy Garoppolo, Russell Wilson, Drew Brees, and Matt Stafford. So if we click on the Lions, you can see Stafford is projected to account for nearly 28% of his team's production. Golden Tate second on the team, about 17.5. And the point being that Stafford projected for a large chunk of his team's production fantasy-wise, and also the 6th most or the 6th highest implied Vegas total. So if you're new, what we do is you take the lines in Vegas for basically over-unders and spreads, and you can say, okay, based on these odds and these lines, we project a team to score, for example, in Detroit, about 25 points. 25 and a quarter points is what their implied Vegas total is. That's the 6th highest. So they would be projected to score the 6th most points this week. Breeze and Stafford are the only 2 of those guys that I mentioned that have, the highest of these Vegas implied totals. So Stafford, a bit of a discount off of some of those top guys where he's probably going to produce a large chunk of his team's fantasy production. So I thought he was interesting. He is the Monday night game, though, and he is at home where he was basically 3.5 points better than he was on the road last season. All right, we'll run through a couple quickly here. Go back to the cheat sheet. Very, very cheap plays. Tyrod Taylor, I don't think is terrible. He had the 3rd most, let's see if I can pull this up real quick, 3rd most rushing attempts by quarterbacks last year. So here you go. Cam Newton, 139 rush attempts, Russell Wilson, 95, and then Tyrod at 84. Obviously playing for Cleveland. We don't know how that's going to shake out for him this year, but assuming he's in a much better situation, much better offense, he's not going to stop running. I think he's a pretty decent play. And then I also don't mind Case Keenum, an improvement basically over anything in Denver that they had last year. At home against what I think is going to be a really, really poor Seattle defense this year. He's a highly efficient quarterback. He's not going to throw a bunch of interceptions and get you in trouble, so I think that's okay. But the guy that I will probably have the most exposure to is our buddy Dak Prescott. And what I want to show you here is pretty interesting. So I'm going to pull up Dak on the player profile. And we're going to see that Dak was incredibly volatile last year. Lowest game was, 2.8. His floor was 2.8 DraftKings points, but his ceiling was 30 DraftKings points. He scored over 25 DraftKings points 4 separate times last year, which was like only a few guys were better than that. So, for example, Breeze did it twice, Brady did it 3 times, and Cam Newton did it the same amount 4 times as Dak. Obviously, the volatility is much, much higher for someone like Dak Prescott. But, this is a pretty good situation. So if you go back and look at how many fantasy points Carolina gave up last year, for the whole season, they're basically middle of the road. But if you change this to the last half of the year, they're the 4th worst offense against opposing quarterbacks. We'll talk about it more in a second. This Dallas offense has a lot of pieces missing from it. It's going to be the Dak and Zeke show, like for sure. So I don't mind Dak coming in at $5,500, nearly the min price, where you get a lot of upside. He's just as likely to score 2 points as he is 30, but I like to tap into that upside. I'm going to skip running backs for a second because since we just talked about quarterbacks, I am going to talk about some guys that you might want to stack these quarterbacks with in terms of pass catchers and wide receivers. So let's go to that example for last year, what Dallas had and what they're missing this year. We'll just stay with this. And you can see basically over 50% of Dallas's targets last year are no longer on the team. Dez had 31% of the targets. He's gone. Jason Witten, 20%. He retired. That's a lot of production that we're going to have to fill, right? So I'll go to the lobby real quick here. The most realistic options here are both pretty cheap plays. You have Allen Hurns, who probably steps in as, he's got to be the number one play or the number one wide receiver, right? I mean, he's just by volume alone, he's probably going to have to be the guy in Dallas. And then you also get Michael Gallup, who rookie, really good preseason with Dak. They seem to have a nice little bit of chemistry. Obviously, it's hard in a small sample size to try to determine that. But again, lot of opportunity for both of these guys that's opening up, and they're both really, really cheap. So you'll probably see me playing quite a bit of those guys here in week 1. All right, I'll stay on theme with guys, with pass catchers for the quarterbacks that we've talked about thus far. And I'll go back and talk about New Orleans, who I think is pretty interesting. So let me see if I can do this real quick. If we go to New Orleans, and just to show you the targets and the rush attempts last year. Now, let's talk a little bit of strategy in general. If you're trying to win a GPP or the Millionaire Maker, for example, pairing your quarterback with a wide receiver, beneficial play. It's a highly correlated play. Those guys score well together. Pairing your quarterback with its running back is a negatively correlated play. So it's not necessarily optimal, but it is possible to win that way. It's possible to stack a team and win a GPP that way. And I think it also depends on the type of running back that you get. So Alvin Kamara, who had 102 targets last year, which is what you're seeing on the screen right now. I think there was only 3 running backs who had that many targets last year. And then he also had 120 rush attempts, which was second to Mark Ingram's 230. Now, Mark Ingram suspended for the first 4 games. It's not like plug and play now Kamara is necessarily going to get 30 carries and 8 targets a game, but a much larger opportunity for a guy that was already incredibly efficient, probably to a point that he cannot sustain it, but the usage is going to be out of control for the first 4 weeks. So I don't necessarily mind, even in cash games, pairing up Breeze and Kamara, just because the floor should be so high against Tampa Bay. Like, these guys are going to have to run the show. Otherwise, I will show you, I actually don't know if I have it handy, but Michael Thomas, the number 1 receiver for the Saints, also a very safe play. Of the top 14, I think he finished 8th in fantasy points for wide receivers last year. Of the top 14 guys, he was the safest. He had the lowest standard deviation. So you're not going to get super high outputs from Michael Thomas on a weekly basis, but a really, really good, strong, safe floor. All right, let's hop back to running backs here. So I'm going to open up this chart, and this is essentially salary up the y-axis, projected points across the x. Trying to find some value here. And what you're looking at, or I can describe this to you, is basically that top tier of guys, the top 4 running backs, Le'Veon, Todd Gurley, David Johnson, and Alvin Kamara, essentially splitting hairs. They're all within a few points of each other. They're all within at least $1,000 of each other, from the most expensive to the cheapest of those 4 guys. I don't really think you can go wrong rostering any of them. Obviously, a little bit concerned about how many touches Le'Veon Bell would get after a holdout. We saw it last year. I think he only had 13 carries week 1. So that type of thing is a concern. The rest of these guys, kind of splitting hairs. I probably prefer David Johnson and Alvin Kamara. They're cheaper, and they're probably a larger percentage of their team's, respective fantasy production on a given week. So I probably prefer those guys, but I'm not going to be mad at you for rostering any of them. They're all with incredible upside. Talked a little bit about Zeke. Zeke's going to get a ton of touches. End of story. Let's talk about Melvin Gordon here. So I'm going to go back to our production last year, because this actually surprised me a little bit too. And we'll just go league wide here. I didn't realize how many touches Melvin Gordon had last year. Le'Veon Bell led the league. LaShawn McCoy was second. And then Melvin Gordon was third. That surprised me more than Todd Gurley, more than Leonard Fournette, more than Zeke Elliott, more than guys that you would expect, that are more of these workload heavy guys. So he stayed healthy all year. He piled up carries, and I was pretty shocked by that. And then what you get here is, here we go. I can show you the red zone numbers from last year. And here we go. Here we go. So inside the 20, Melvin Gordon led the league in his team's percentage of rushing attempts. So he had 73% of his team's red zone rushes. That was tops in the league. Now, he didn't have as many as Todd Gurley or Le'Veon Bell. He finishes third in total number of rushes, but that's kind of because the LA offense obviously wasn't in the red zone as often, right? He actually got a larger percentage of those by his team. So again, he's going to garner a ton of touches and a ton of high leverage touches in LA. Next up, I like Joe Mixon a little bit here. So Mixon is pretty clearly like the goal line. I don't want to call it the goal line. I want to call it like the end zone option for Cincinnati. So here's what we do. So if we pull up Mixon, and I'm actually going to sort this by percentage of rushes inside the 10. So we're getting even closer to the goal line. So inside the 20, Mixon only saw 47% of his team's carries. Inside the 10, it jumps to 78%. It's most in the league, highest in the league. Then you go inside the 5, and he's second most in the league. 85% of his team's rushes in there. So they're giving him the rock in the most high leverage positions on the field that you could ask for. Additionally, Gio Bernard's still on this team, but didn't really play all that much in the preseason. It's pretty clear that Joe Mixon is going to be the 3-down back, maybe outside of some very specific, obvious passing situations where Gio Bernard will get on the field. Mixon seems to be the guy. Jeremy Hill's gone. His 13% of the Bengals carries are now available. So Mixon, I think the volume is going to be there. I think it's still suspect on whether he is an efficient enough runner in the league to be like a really, really good fantasy option. But especially with running backs, it's all about opportunity, and Mixon certainly seems to be going to garner a lot of opportunity. And then I really can't end this section without talking about Christian McCaffrey and how sexy his upside is. It's one of these things where, he's not going to get probably 30 carries and 8 targets a game, but led the league in targets. I believe, don't quote me on this, I think he's the only running back who led his team in targets, right? I could look that up, but I'm pretty sure he's the only guy. He actually led the Panthers in targets last year. There's so much to like. He's completely touchdown independent. So we talk about guys being touchdown dependent. McCaffrey's the opposite, right? I think he was, running back 14 last year in DraftKings scoring. Only scored 2 rushing touchdowns, 6 through the air. Still 8 total touchdowns is, okay for a guy in that range. I think he has much more upside to tap into, and I think we might see it this year. So can't overlook McCaffrey when it comes to running backs. And then we'll talk about tight ends. And unfortunately, the tight end conversation, is pretty short. It's pretty quick. There's not a lot of great options. You're either paying up for one of these studs, or you're laying down and taking a flyer down at the bottom. So what can we do? Gronk, pretty clearly the number one option. And I say that he's $6,900. He's my highest projected tight end. He's got all the target volume that you would expect from a high-end number one. I would like Zach Ertz more if Carson Wentz was playing. So just kind of if we go back last year, and I know this is a really, really small sample size, so don't kill me on this. But, Nick Foles played full-time in weeks 15 and 16 last year. So I'm just going to sort by 15 and 16. He came in at the end of week 14. He came out early at the end of week 17. So we're just going to look at 15 and 16. I think it was 15 and 16. Stand by. Excuse me, it was weeks 14 and 15, the Giants and Oakland. And you can see the target breakdown for just those 2 weeks. Ertz was the fourth most targeted option on this Philadelphia offense, right? Nick Foles used his wide receivers a lot more than when we saw Carson Wentz in the game, for example. So Nicky Foles, 9 targets to Zach Ertz. He caught 6 of them, 56 yards. So I think Ertz is a great play. I don't know if there's anything to this, but it's just giving me a little bit of caution when paying up for Zach Ertz. I'd actually might prefer someone like Travis Kelce, who's $200 cheaper, and then you get a guy who's much more ingrained in his offense. So if I go to Kansas City and go to the full season last year, and again, he's gonna have a new quarterback, but 122 targets last year, led his team as a tight end. That's someone who I'd prefer to target over Ertz, but again, like, they both have question marks. Jimmy Graham has a ton of question marks. I think Jimmy Graham's going to be completely dependent on touchdowns, right? They're going to have to use him in the red zone. Someone like Trey Burton, I think, might be more interesting. He's more of a dynamic player in a new role. He's going to be much more involved in the offense than he was in Philadelphia last year. And then even Evan Ingram, who saw a ton of the red zone targets last year, those are probably going to regress a little bit and come back down to the mean. But we are really in kind of dumpster fire territory when it comes to tight ends here. So you can either take a flyer on someone way down the list like a Ricky Seals-Jones or a George Kittle, but I might just opt to take one of their safer plays or just absolutely punt this position one way or another. Let me know what you're going to do at tight end. I think this is the most difficult position. Let me know how you feel about all these guys. You can tweet me. It's at DFS On Demand, or you can leave a comment below. I hope you guys enjoy. Good luck with week 1. See ya.